Buried in Scotland's blood is a story most people have never heard, a story of vanished peoples, ancient migrations, and DNA that changes everything you thought you knew. But here's a question most people never stop to ask. Who are the Scottish people really? Not in terms of culture or language or pride. At the genetic level, at the level of ancient DNA that does not lie and does not bend to politics or national mythology, because what scientists have uncovered over the last decade is truly surprising. The story of Scottish origins is not the one most people assume. It includes near total population, replacement, unexpected connections to the ancient Eurasian steppe, traces of distant ancestry hidden in the Scottish gene pool, and a genetic landscape so layered and complex that even researchers were surprised. In this video, we're going to walk through all of it, the geography that shaped Scottish DNA, the waves of migration that changed the population again and again, what the latest ancient DNA studies actually found, and what it all means for Scottish identity today. Some of what we are going to cover will surprise you. Some of it might even challenge what you thought you knew. Let's find out who the Scottish people really are. To understand Scottish genetics, you have to start with the land itself, because in Scotland, geography did not just shape culture and history. It shaped who survived, who mixed with whom, and who stayed isolated for long, enough to develop their own distinct genetic signature. Scotland is divided in ways that matter deeply to this story. The highlands and islands in the north and west, the lowlands stretching across the center and south, the northern isles of Orkney and Shetland, sitting closer to Norway than to London. These are not just scenic differences. They are genetic boundaries, drawn by mountains, sea channels, and centuries of relative isolation. Modern DNA studies have confirmed something remarkable. Scotland does not have one genetic profile. It has several. Researchers have identified a clear northeast to southwest genetic divide, a split that runs deep through the population and maps almost perfectly onto the historical territories of two of Scotland's most ancient peoples. That is not a coincidence, and we will come back to it. But here is what makes Scotland's geography truly fascinating. Its remoteness did not only keep people in, it also made Scotland a destination, reachable by sea from Scandinavia, Ireland, and even farther away. The ocean was not a wall. It was a highway, and people used it. Let's go back to the very beginning of the Scottish story. Around 12,000 years ago, the last ice age was ending. The glaciers that had covered Scotland for thousands of years were pulling back, and for the first time, the land was becoming livable. The first people to arrive were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, nomadic groups who followed the retreating ice northward, tracking animals and living off a landscape that was still raw and newly uncovered. These were Scotland's first inhabitants. And while their genetic contribution to modern Scots is fairly small, it has not disappeared completely. Traces of their ancient DNA still remain in the Scottish population today, a faint but real echo of the people who first looked out over those empty glens and decided to stay. Then, around 6,000 years ago, a wave of farmers began arriving from Anatolia, the region we now call Turkey, and from the wider Near East. These were Neolithic people, and they brought with them something that would change Scotland forever: agriculture, domesticated animals, new technologies, and a completely new way of life. Their genetic impact was deep. These Neolithic farmers did not just pass through. They settled, they built, and they left their mark on the land in ways that are still visible today. The Callanish Stones on the Isle of Lewis, the Ring of Brodgar in Orkney, these extraordinary monuments are their legacy. built by a people whose DNA still flows, in part through modern Scottish veins. So by roughly 4,000 years ago, Scotland had already gone through its first major genetic transformation. The original hunter-gatherers had been largely absorbed or replaced by incoming farmers. The population had changed, but the biggest upheaval was still to come, and when it arrived, it would be almost total. If the arrival of Neolithic farmers was a transformation, what happened next was something closer to an erasure. Around 4,500 years ago, a group known as the Bell Beaker people began moving into Britain, including Scotland, named after their distinctive bell-shaped pottery. These migrants came from continental Europe and carried with them a genetic profile dramatically different from the Neolithic farmers already living there, and the scale of what followed is truly shocking. Genetic studies suggest that Bell Beaker migrants may have replaced up to 90% of the local Neolithic population's ancestry. 90%. Let that sink in. The people who built the great stone monuments, who had farmed the Scottish landscape for thousands of years, were almost completely replaced. Genetically, within a fairly short period, it is one of the most dramatic demographic events in all of British prehistory. What caused this replacement is not fully understood. It may have included conflict. It may have included disease. It may have been a slower process of absorption and replacement over generations. What the DNA tells us is the outcome, not the mechanism, but the outcome was clear. Now, this is also the period linked with the later spread of Celtic languages and culture across Scotland and much of Britain. But here the picture becomes more complex, and it is worth slowing down because the Celtic cultural spread that followed in the Bronze and Iron Ages seems to have worked differently from the Bell Beaker replacement, where Bell Beaker migrants largely replaced the existing population. Genetically, the spread of culture seems to have been adopted by local populations rather than forced through another wave of mass replacement. People change their language, their burial practices, their metalworking traditions, their social structures without being replaced completely. Culture spread. Genetics mostly stayed. This difference matters. It tells us that the Scottish gene pool was not endlessly flexible, always rewritten by each new arrival. After the Bell Beaker upheaval, there was a degree of continuity. The foundation had been reset almost completely, but from that point on, the story becomes one of layering rather than replacement. By the Iron Age, Scotland had taken on a genetic shape that would prove surprisingly lasting, and at the center of that story are the Picts, perhaps the most mysterious people in Scottish history, the tribal confederations that the Romans called the Painted People, the inhabitants of the north and east who resisted conquest and left behind carved stones of extraordinary beauty and almost no written records. So who were the Picts? Genetically, the answer, when it finally came from ancient DNA research, was both clear and quietly remarkable. The Picts were not a separate or isolated population. They were not dramatically different from other Iron Age peoples living across Britain at the same time. What made them distinct was cultural and linguistic, not biological. And their genetic legacy, rather than disappearing with their culture, is believed to remain today concentrated, especially in northeast Scotland. That geographic detail matters because it matches almost perfectly with the northeast to southwest genetic divide that modern studies have identified in the Scottish population. The ancient boundary between Pictish and Gaelic territories left a mark that DNA can still detect more than 1,000 years later. Then came the Romans. Their occupation never extended fully into Scotland, and their genetic footprint shows that. Some researchers have suggested that the ethnically diverse garrison troops stationed along the northern frontier may have left a faint genetic trace in southern Scotland, though the evidence for this specific signal remains limited. The Roman genetic contribution overall is small, a faint trace rather than a major shift. The Anglo-Saxons, whose influence changed England so dramatically, reached only the edges of Scotland. Their presence moved into the Lothian region in the south, leaving a detectable but limited genetic signature. Scotland's Highland core remained mostly untouched. What all of this tells us is something important. By the end of the first millennium, Scotland had a genetic landscape that was ancient, layered, and remarkably resistant to outside pressure. The real shocks were already in the past. Then came the Vikings, and if any single group left a visible, measurable, undeniable mark on Scottish DNA after the Bell Beaker upheaval, it was the Norse. From 793 AD onward, Scandinavian raiders, traders, and settlers pushed into Scotland with force and frequency, and the genetic evidence they left behind is some of the clearest and most striking in the whole Scottish story. In Orkney studies have found that somewhere between a quarter and a third of DNA traces back to Norwegian sources, among the highest concentrations in all of Britain. In Shetland, the number is just as striking. These are not tiny traces. These are populations that were deeply reshaped by Norse settlement to the point where the Northern Isles feel genetically closer to Scandinavia than to much of mainland Scotland. On the Scottish mainland, the Norse contribution is more modest but still detectable. The Vikings did not just raid and leave. They stayed, they farmed, they married into local populations, and they became part of the genetic fabric of the country. After the Vikings came the Normans. Their conquest of England in 1066 is one of history's most famous events, but their influence on Scotland is less often discussed. Many Norman nobles were granted lands in Scotland, especially under King David. And their genetic contribution, while small overall, is most visible among the Scottish nobility of the 12th and 13th centuries. Less well known is the Flemish influence. Scottish kings, again, especially David I, actively invited Flemish traders and craftsmen to settle in Scotland. Skilled, hardworking, and culturally distinct, these settlers added another quiet thread to the genetic tapestry. And then there is Ireland, the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriada, spanning parts of Ulster and western Scotland in the 5th and 6th centuries, created deep and lasting genetic connections between the two countries, connections that were strengthened again centuries later by mass Irish immigration during the Industrial Revolution. Scotland, it turns out, was never closed. It was always receiving. So what does modern science actually say? When researchers sit down with thousands of DNA samples and run the numbers, the results, it turns out, are extraordinary. The Scotland's DNA project, involving geneticist Dr. Jim Wilson, analyzed a large group of Scottish participants and produced some of the most detailed insights into Scottish genetic heritage ever gathered. What they found was not one unified Scottish genome. It was something much more interesting. Scotland could be broken down into several distinct regional genetic clusters, each carrying its own clear signature, shaped by its own special history of settlement, isolation, and migration. Regions like the Borders, the Southwest, the Hebrides, the Northeast, Orkney, and Shetland each tell a different story. The idea of one single Scottish people, genetically speaking, simply does not hold up. The most striking finding was a Northeast-Southwest genetic divide, a split running through the Scottish population that matches almost exactly the ancient territories of the Picts in the east and the Gaels in the west, cultural and political boundaries that disappeared over 1,000 years ago have left a genetic echo that modern science can still detect. That is remarkable. The Hebrides emerged as a genetic island in the truest sense, relative isolation. Over centuries produced a population with a unique genetic signature, distinct from mainland Scotland, and, interestingly, the Isle of Man clustered genetically with southwest Scotland, a reminder that the sea connected as much as it divided. Then come the truly surprising findings. Steppe ancestry markers linked to the Amnaic culture of the Pontic, Caspian steppe have been identified in the Scottish population, with some studies noting higher levels in island populations, including Orkney, and some genetic studies have identified rare lineages in the Scottish population, with deep roots in North Africa. A marker traced by researchers through the Moorish conquest of Spain and up along the Atlantic coast, a reminder of how far-reaching human movement has always been. Even individual stories carry weight here. Studies have suggested that a notable number of people carrying the surname Stewart may share DNA consistent with the royal line, and the data has also revealed surprising personal connections, unexpected shared lineages between individuals separated by centuries and continents. The data does not just describe populations. Sometimes it finds lost connections hiding in plain sight. So what does all of this actually mean for Scottish identity? Does a complex genetic history weaken what it means to be Scottish? The answer is no. If anything, it does the opposite. What the DNA reveals is that Scotland was never ethnically fixed. It was never sealed. Population untouched and unchanged across the millennia. It was always a place where people arrived, settled, mixed, and built something new. The Bell Beaker people, the Norse settlers, the Flemish craftsmen, the Irish migrants, layer upon layer of humanity, each one adding to something that became clearly and recognizably Scottish. And here's the key point. The clan system is real. The Gaelic language is real. The Highland culture, the literary tradition, the fierce and hard-won sense of national identity, all of it is real. None of that is weakened by genetic complexity. If anything, it becomes more impressive because of it, because what Scottish identity represents is not the product of biological purity. It is the product of resilience of a people who absorbed wave after wave of change, internal and external, and came out the other side with something lasting, distinct, and worth being proud of. The genetics do not complicate that story. They confirm it. So, were the Scottish people ever who we thought they were? The honest answer is that they were always more ancient, more layered, more connected to the wider human story than any simple national story could capture. From the first, hunter-gatherers making their way across a newly thawed landscape, to Neolithic farmers raising stones that still stand today, to Bronze Age migrants who rewrote the genetic code of an entire population, to Norse settlers who made the Northern Isles their own. Scotland has never been one single story. It has always been many stories braided together over 12,000 years. The ancient DNA research that has appeared over the last decade is truly transformative, but it is also incomplete. New studies are coming. New samples are being analyzed, and with each one, the picture will become clearer, revealing details we cannot yet imagine. What we can say with confidence today is this: the Scottish people are not who most assumed them to be. They are something far more interesting, a living record of human movement, resilience, and adaptation, written not only in books or monuments, but in the DNA of every person who calls Scotland home. If this story moved you, share it, like it, and stay with us because there is much more to explore.